Welcome to CLIBURN Masterpiece. I'm Buddy Bray. I'm your host for this series, and we come to you from the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. In CLIBURN Masterpiece, we delve into some of the greatest masterworks ever written for the piano. We visit with some of our CLIBURN laureates and other noted experts in the field of music and in other fields as well. A work composed in 1990, only 30 years ago, and it's already entered the permanent piano repertoire of many young solo pianists around the world. Today we're going to be talking about the Piano Sonata No. 1 by the Australian composer Carl Vine. We'll talk to Mr. Vine about the work, and also from the 2013 CLIBURN, we'll both talk to and hear Steven Lin. That's coming up. Can we just immediately go back to 1990 and the circumstances surrounding the composition of this first piano sonata? We should mention, of course, that you have several others. You're all the way up to Piano Sonata No. 4, and then you have a sonata for four hands as well. But speaking of the first piano sonata, it began life in an unusual sort of way. Can we talk about that a little bit?
It began life as a commission for Sydney Dance Company, and I had worked with Sydney Dance Company for, at that time, already for, 15 years. And the director of the company, Graham Murphy, is a very musical choreographer, and he had realized by that time, he was a very seasoned choreographer, and he realized that the music he liked to choreograph best was strong concert music. And so he made no bones about it. He said, I want you to write a concert work. And so there was no assumption of any storyline or narrative. That was entirely up to me if there was one or not. But he said, it has to be a strong concert work, and then I can work with it. And I knew that was true. The other thing which is synchronous with that is that I had been playing piano professionally for 15 years by that stage, playing all contemporary music. So I was a very good pianist at playing contemporary music. I wasn't so good at playing classical repertoire, but I was a good contemporary pianist. But this was a time at which, and I'd tried to write a number of piano solos before that, and every time I cast myself as the soloist. And basically I'd dumbed down the composition so I could play it. And the great breakthrough in the first sonata was that I was never going to play it. And all of a sudden I had this great sense of relief and release that there was some other bunny who was going to put in all the hard yards and actually work out how to play the thing. All I had to do was make it interesting. The third factor then is that my party piece at the time was Elliott Carter's first piano sonata, and I played that dozens of times all around Australia, and I think I've even played it in the States. That work was the model, the absolute pure model for my sonata.
There are lots of observable similarities. One is the sort of fleet pianissimo, but very virtuosic, fast writing for the piano, which Elliott Carter uses in the sonata and then later in Cotton Air and pieces like that, of course. So that certainly makes an appearance in your first piano sonata. We'll get to that in a minute. Also, that it's two movements is something else that it has in common. At what point then did it go to the choreographer and then to the dancers? What was that process like?
Modern musicians cannot begin to imagine what the technology was like 30 years ago. It was so incredibly primitive. But I did have to produce something for Graham to think about and choreograph, and so it was a MIDI playback out of my computer, and it was one of the earliest scores I did on computer. And so it was exactly the written tempo. Every metric modulation, every component of it was exactly correct, which meant that when Michael premiered it with the dance company, he had by that time got quite fast. And whereas the choreography had been to the moderately staid version straight out of the MIDI playback, if they'd tried to dance it at Michael's speed, there would have been limbs flying off all over the place, pirouettes with legs in the air, and it would have been a complete mess. So he actually had to bring it down several notches. There is a YouTube clip of the second movement, and it has this on stage, this massive bar of headlights that dancers dodge beneath, and so it's lowered, and at the very end all the headlights come on and blare straight into the eyes of the audience. Now there's absolutely no reason for that whatsoever, but it looks terrific.
It's one of those great pieces which audiences love. They love to listen to it, they love to watch it. But pianists seem to really like to play it. It's popular amongst pianists. Why do you think that is?
I remember before learning this piece, I was predominantly playing, the classic, the Mozarts, the Chopin, Liszt. And I mean, I think during one studio class, there started to be a lot of more and more students trying to play some modern pieces, and this was one of the one that sort of caught my ears very well, because I think it was, I was a very young kid. I mean, I don't know, to put it very honestly, I just thought it was a cool piece.
It's one of the only pieces written in the late 20th century that has entered the repertoire. It has entered the repertoire internationally. Did this surprise you?
It wasn't until the early 2000s that I discovered it had a concert life. And in the middle of that period, I'd actually stopped composing. I had a sabbatical for about 4 years because I was actually quite disillusioned with composing and contemporary music and the whole process. And I'd also worn myself thin. And so when I came back to composing in 2002, I was amazed to discover there were people who knew about this work.
From just a pianistic standpoint, does it lie under your hands well?
Yes, for the most part, and there were a couple sections where, you had to work through it. And I don't think that's because it's not pianistic. I think it is. It's just each composer has, his or her own way of writing and listening. So, and Carl Vine certainly has his own, upbringing as a musician, his own way, his own style, his own language.
When we talk about different language, a different language than Chopin or maybe Beethoven used, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a different language right from the very beginning. It's based on those kinds of intervals, that interval rather than that one. So whereas Beethoven might have written this, Carl Vine writes harmony stacked like that, and it brings a different atmosphere to the piece right from the very beginning. I think it's almost, to me, it's almost like a jazz pianist improvising. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Especially the first section is very improvisatory.
What about improvisation? Here, I'm asking about improvisation because there are places in the sonata where the atmosphere is one of improvisation. The end of the first movement, for instance, seems sort of improvisatory. Also, the piece itself just seems so fluent, like you wrote it in an hour.
Yeah, it did take longer than that. And interestingly, the improvisatory slow section at the end of the first movement was probably the hardest thing to write, because it's actually meticulous. But to answer your question, yes, I do improvise, and a lot of that was improvisatory, and some of the structure was organic. It just kind of grew, and I thought, well, I'll leave that there. But the basic idea of following the Carter structure was still the plan.
And then we get to the famous part here.
That's a big reason why I started learning this piece. I thought
that part.
I think I was like 19 or something. I thought it was so cool.
What is it about that figure that becomes an earworm?
Mainly it's because of the rhythm and how it's written, where the accent is, and I don't know. It just sounds cool the way he imagined this.
Can you give us a real pithy 2-sentence for the layman about exactly what metric modulation is? Because it's also something that maybe you modeled after Elliott Carter a little bit. He was certainly a master at metric modulation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Simple version, if you start off in 3/4, taka 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 taka, and the next bar you make 12/8, sorry, 12/16. So you go taka 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 taka. That is metric modulation. So you have one rhythmic element in common on both sides. At the beginning of the second movement. The Carter, as you know, begins with a fugue. And I was aiming for a fugue. I didn't quite get there, but I did start with this heavy sort of canonic imitation.
How did you know that you had set out to write something imitative or a fugue or some such? At what point do you know it does not work?
Yeah, it's tricky, and it's. I have found out a million different ways that things don't work in the past 45 years. So yeah, it changes. With this one, I was trying to think of some fugal subject, and I came up with that sort of thing. But then it was all about making it an interesting melodic process, and I was thinking initially I could make that into a fugal subject. It just doesn't fit. Or at least I couldn't make it fit. But what I came up with, I thought, was actually more interesting than a fugue.
The beginning of the second movement, which seems, I've never played the piece, but it seems particularly treacherous. Is that a scary place to play in the piece?
I remember when I first learning it, it was definitely very difficult because it's your left and right hand are playing this, in unison. And usually, I'm a righty, so my right hand is much better than my left hand and those fast, light stuff. But I think as you work on it, it's one of those things that after some repetitive practicing, it gets easier. Plus, you have the whole first movement to warm up.
When you hear the piece now, do you think of it as a piece that you wrote 30 years ago, or do you think that sounds just like you?
There are common elements with what I've written since. So over the 30-year period, I think my language has evolved, one would hope, but there are still elements in common. I discover I am unable to write music now that doesn't sound like me. So I have a number of common licks of favourite expressions, modes, chords, progressions, and they just come out. I do try with each work. With each work, I'm trying to do something different.
Do you compose at the piano?
All the time. I have done so from my earliest days, so from student days. A couple of times I thought I should do it because Rachmaninoff didn't. He composed at a desk, and I find that baffling because it's such pianistic, even the orchestral stuff is so pianistic. But no, I've always worked at the keyboard, and it's part of my thought process. I actually think keyboardish. And occasionally I dream about compositions, and I always dream in hand positions, even if it's a string quartet.
Is there any isolation that has to occur when you're starting to write a new piece? Getting other people's notes out of your head?
I don't need that period of isolation. I do start any idea at all and then see if I can tease it out into a useful compositional structure. And so that is the time at which I improvise. Then it becomes working out a sort of both a grammar and a geometry that is going to carry the work through.
Did the piece take you a long time to write or a short time to write? Because you have said that it was sort of, your model was the Elliott Carter Sonata. It seems sort of inspired by the Carter Sonata, but it also seems, just to me, to be sort of an inspiration, to be a piece that did not struggle in its unfolding.
Honestly, I cannot remember. It wasn't quick. It was probably 3 months, which is average for a 20-minute piece. Originally, it was 20 minutes long. It's now 16 or 17. It's compressed. It's compressed with age. But yeah, so that is normal. Certainly, it took more than 2 months. What I wanted to do was achieve what Carter achieved, which is the resonance in the piano and the fluidity. This was the guiding principle of the whole thing, that everything in it was fluid and that it would take the pianist on a journey as well as the audience.
Let me take you back to the 2013 competition. Do you remember what it was like to play the Vine Sonata in that competition? Do you remember how you were feeling?
I remember. I enjoyed it a lot. I think the audience. I think it's obviously the audience is a big part of what we do. So they were really warm and enthusiastic, I think. So I remember really I enjoyed playing that piece there.
Our thanks to Steven Lin and to composer Carl Vine for joining us for this episode of CLIBURN Masterpiece. And now here is 2013 Jury Discretionary Award winner Steven Lin playing Carl Vine's Piano Sonata No. 1. This is a performance from the 2013 edition of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. We hope you enjoy it. A brilliant performance of the Piano Sonata No. 1 by Australian composer Carl Vine. That's from the 2013 Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. You heard it played by Steven Lin. Our thanks to Steven for joining us to chat about the sonata, and of course, many, many thanks to Carl Vine joining us from Australia to talk about his own work. Thanks as always to the Kimball Art Museum for hosting us. I'm Buddy Bray for CLIBURN Masterpiece, and thank you for watching.